What's up, YouTube fans? The topic for this video, right, is the evolutionary reducibility of vocalization, right? The voice, right, the ability for us to have a voice, right? The fact that I'm talking to you guys right now, right? How did that come about evolutionarily? Can it be broken down into a series of steps, each useful in its own right? Yes, it can, right? First off, we find vocalization, right, in many varying degrees of complexity within the animal kingdom, right? So it's most complex of all in us humans, right? Because we have very complex languages, right? But we find many other creatures, right, have languages, right, to a lesser degree, right? Like dolphins, for example, right, are observed to have languages, right? We can tell that it's a language, right, when we observe like patterns of the sound, right, correlated, right, with various things they're doing, right? We can infer that they're having a language, right? Although less complex than that of humans, right? And then furthermore, many creatures, right, vocalize for purposes aside from even using it as a language, right? So that's even simpler of a purpose, right? So like dogs, for example, will growl and they'll woof at people and various things outside of the window, right? And when they do that, it's not like that it's even like a word or like having like it's not like part of like a language system where it's like meaning any particular like word per se. They're basically just making a noise for the purpose of like intimidation, right? Which can have obvious evolutionary advantages if you think about it, right? Because it could help in making them seem more threatening to like a predator, for example, right? Therefore making the predator more likely to not eat them, right? Simple as that. And I mean, vocalization of this more basic type is also used by humans, right? Particularly babies, right? So I mean, like babies will like cry, they'll like whine, like wah, and that's not actual like words, right? But it helps like the parents to know like that the baby like needs like food or whatever. And then we also see vocalization used for the purpose of singing. This is seen in many creatures, birds sing, gibbons sing, humans sing, right? And one of the purposes that can have evolutionary advantage for a creature to sing, right, is that it can help to attract a mate, right? We see this in many creatures that they sing specifically for the purpose of attracting a mate, right? They don't just like sing like to like serenade us humans or whatever. They actually sing. There's a correlation that we can observe that they sing for the purpose of attracting a mate. And that gives evolutionary advantage because it makes them more likely to have sex and therefore more likely to produce offspring, right? If they can produce a serenading sound that attracts a mate, right? And so we find vocalization at many varying degrees of complexity, right? It doesn't have to be at the human level of complexity to have any use at all, right? And then furthermore, in demonstrating the evolutionary reducibility of the ability to vocalize, it's important to furthermore notice, right, that several of the organs that we use for the purpose of vocalization are also just as much useful for other purposes like digestion and respiration, right? They're just as much useful for those other purposes, right? Therefore, meaning that when they first were evolved, they didn't have to originally have the purpose of being used for vocalization. They didn't need to originally have that purpose in order to have any evolutionary advantage, right? And so therefore, they didn't even need to originally have that purpose. The purpose could be a later modification, right? Because so like our mouth, right, and our pharynx, right, are used for digestive purposes, right, and also for respiratory purposes, right? So they have evolutionary advantage without being used for vocalization. Our jaws and our teeth also, and our tongue. Speaking of which, I'm hearing my dog upstairs woofing, so that relates to the video. But our jaws and teeth and our tongue, those are just as much useful for digestion, right? So that alone would allow for them to have evolutionary advantage. They didn't even have to necessarily be used for vocalization when they were first evolved. They could still have evolutionary advantage just as well for being used for digestion, right? And also our lungs play a crucial role in our ability to vocalize, and yet they are just as well useful for respiration. And our nasal cavity plays a large role in people's capacity for vocalization, people and many other animals. But the nasal cavity also serves other purposes such as olfaction and respiration, right? And so really most of the organs that we use for vocalization, right, are just as much useful, right, for the purpose, for various other purposes, right? And this is a perfect example, right, of how organ or biological system, what have you, it doesn't actually have to have the same purpose every step along the way in order to have any useful purpose at all, right? We see plenty of examples of that. Also our arms and hands originally were legs and feet. That's a very different purpose, but a useful purpose nonetheless, right? And what's funny is, so like Michael Behe, who is the person who coined the term irreducible complexity, one of his main things that he would use is an example of like something that we know is intelligently designed because it is irreducibly complex, was a mousetrap. He uses that as an example, and he says how it's irreducibly complex because you need all the parts together at once in order for it to work. Otherwise, it won't work, he says, right? But what people have pointed out, right, is that a mousetrap actually isn't irreducibly complex, because if you take out some of the parts, it still can be useful for other purposes, like being used as a tie clip, right? But what many creationists have tried to say then is like, no, it still is irreducibly complex, because it doesn't work as a mousetrap unless it has all the parts together at once. But it's like that totally misses how evolution works, right? Because it really doesn't matter if something every step along the way has the same purposes as it now has. All that really matters is that every step along the way it has some purpose that could have evolutionary advantage. It really doesn't matter at all if it has the same purpose every step along the way, right? And so one of countless examples, right, of where some, features that could be, features could have a totally new purpose that they're modified towards along the way, and we can demonstrate that the earlier purposes still would have had evolutionary advantage. Nonetheless, we can prove that it still would, right? One of countless examples, right, is how several of the organs that we use for vocalization are just as much useful for other purposes like digestion and respiration and olfaction, right? And furthermore, what you'll want to note, right, is that some of these organs, right, can like incidentally produce sound, right? So I mean, like think about like how when a person like farts, right, that produces a sound, right? But it's not like there's any use to the fact that it produces a sound. It's really just incidental that it produces a sound, right, when you fart, right? And then also think about how even with your mouth closed, with your nose alone, you can produce sounds, right? So listen here. You could probably hear that, right? It produces a sound, just me inhaling there, right? And so, I mean, or like if I were to chatter my teeth, like, you could hear that, right? And so, it's it's really pretty easy, really, to see how vocalization, right, could when it first started being a thing, right, it really could just be something that creatures incidentally were able to do based on other features that already had purposes anyways. And then over time the ability could be improved upon via natural selection, right? And so I mean, even like when a person like snores, right, that makes noise, right? Or if a person is like out of breath, it makes noise. They're not actually using that for like communicating or anything. The noise in of itself has no useful function. It's really just incidental that a noise is being produced, right? And so there you have it. The evolutionary what one also you'll want to note, right, that that fish, for example, right, even though they do not have a larynx and they do not have vocal cords, right, they can still some of them still can vocalize, right, without those organs, right, which further demonstrates the reducibility of the capacity to vocalize. Even with us humans, right, if a person has their vocal cords removed, that does not make them incapable of vocalizing. They still could vocalize. And within amongst the animal kingdom and even within a single species such as humans, right, vocalization can be done in many differing ways, right? So I mean, there's click languages, right, is called, right, some languages in Africa, right, where some of their like sounds that they make is a sound where it's like it's like very different from like how we would vocalize in English, right? But that's just comes normal for them. It comes natural, right? That's how they vocalize, right? And so many differing methodologies for vocalization are just as well good, right? And so it really doesn't need to be the one that you happen to be using in order to have any use, right? And so it's really fairly straightforward to understand how it can come about incidentally and be improved upon over time via natural selection, right? All right, that's all for now. See you guys.